Got dreams of being a professional podcaster, but have no idea what you're doing?
This is impossible.
That's about to change.
A new kind of school.
Welcome to the Pod School Podcast.
Welcome to the show. Today's episode is all about podcast hosting, and it is inspired by the delightful Dylan, who sent me an email asking, is it worth getting a podcast host when you're starting out, or is it best to go solo? The answer to this question is always 100% get yourself a podcast host. Unless you know how to whittle up your own RSS feed, which most of us don't, you are going to need a podcast host because they are going to make your life so much easier. When you are just starting out and you've never done any podcasting before, it can seem like the process of speaking into a microphone and actually getting what you lay down onto an MP3 into people's ears is like some kind of weird audio voodoo. I got the image of sort of Mike TV from the original Charlie and the Chocolate Factory in bits above the head of Willy Wonka as he goes from the little platform to the television. It feels like that's how it gets into people's ears. And with a podcast host, all of that magical little bitsy Mike TV magic can happen without you having to do a darn thing. So just to break it down, the three things really involved in podcasting is an MP3, which means the episode that you've actually recorded and exported in your audio editing software to an MP3. Then you need a podcasting host, which is going to give you a place to upload those MP3s, insert all of your episode information, and also create what's called an RSS feed. And then that's the third thing that you need, because that's how directories and podcasting apps find your new episode so they can show people who've subscribed to your show that there is a new episode available. Essentially, the RSS feed just looks like a whole bunch of numbers and letters, but when Apple Podcasts gets a hold of it, it turns all of those numbers and letters into information that ends up being your episode list and your show name and title and your show artwork and everything, so that it looks all snazzy when it gets to Apple Podcasts. The podcasting host is the guy right in the middle who takes all of your lovely MP3s and hides them away in a nice little storage facility, and then when somebody wants to download your episode, they're the person that shows them where to download that episode, and you don't have to do a single thing. All of the magic happens behind the scenes. So it's very, very important that when you're podcasting, you get a host, because that's the only way that the directories are going to be able to find your show. And if you want to be found by listeners, you have to be where the listeners are going to find shows. So basically, if you know nothing about RSS feeds and how they come about and what they do, you don't need to know a single thing if you have a podcast host. Having that podcast host there means you're not housing your MP3s, your audio, in the media section of your website. That is a big no-no, because obviously the point of having a podcast is to get an audience. But if you have your MP3s housed on your website and you've got a large audience, your website is going to be running at a pace that everybody will be describing as glacial. It will slow your website down, whereas these guys, the podcast hosts like Libsyn, Whooshkaa, Blueberry, these places have a whole bunch of bandwidth that your listeners can chew right up, and they can take care of all of that for you without slowing down your website. It is absolutely impossible to go it alone without a podcast host if you are just starting out. And the other thing that they have that's great is support, and often they have tutorials and they have a whole bunch of analytics so that you know exactly how many people are downloading your show, where they're coming from, and all of that important stuff that you want to have at your disposal if you want to get advertisers on board in the future, and if you just want to brag about your sweet numbers. So the answer to today's question, do you need a podcast host, is a big resounding yes. Thank you so much, Dylan, for the question, and I will detail everything that I'm referring to on the show notes page of this episode. So head to podschoolpodcast.com and type host into the search bar, and this will pop right up. I'll have all of the links to all of the different directories and also all of the different hosts that you can use so that you know exactly where to find them. Of course, if you need any extra training or anything a little bit more in depth, you can head to podschool.com.au to find out more about my online podcasting course, which takes you step by step through every part of the process, because it can be darn daunting when you're doing it by yourself. Thanks so much for listening, and I will see you next week for another episode of the Pod School Podcast.
That's all for today.